Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Jamara Davis Welch, and today I'm back with our final video in our series exploring my new book, High Value, The Prayer of a Queen. We have journeyed through Esther's story from her struggles to her faith, from her strategic wisdom to even lessons about pride from her enemy, Haman. Today, I want to delve into how Esther used the Persian legal system to save her people. Now, while not much is known about Vashti, I'm sure that we can all agree that if you've seen any movies about Esther, Vashti is traditionally portrayed as this arrogant queen who dishonored her husband. Even in the Septuagint, she's painted in this light. But the ancient historian Josephus gives us a different perspective that might make us think twice about that characterization. And let me tell you why Josephus matters. He was a first century historian who had access to historical records that may no longer exist today. While no historian is infallible, his works are particularly valuable because of his proximity to these events and his access to ancient Persian records. Now, let me share what happened according to the king's advisors. In the Septuagint, one of them named Memucan tells the king that Vashti's refusal wasn't an offense to just the king, but basically to all married Persian men. He claimed that their wives would have no respect for their husbands if they had, quote, such an example of arrogance in the queen. But here's where it gets interesting. When Vashti refused to appear before the king's drunken guest, she wasn't being rebellious. According to Josephus, she was actually following Persian law, which forbade wives from being seen by strangers. Now think about this. If her commitment to following the law wasn't honoring her husband and all Persian men, then what was? The irony here is striking. Her obedience to the law was interpreted as disobedience to her husband and disrespect to all Persian husbands. So here you have a woman following the established law of the land, yet somehow that's turned into an act of rebellion against all married men in Persia. And in my own personal opinion, consider how undignified it would have been for a queen to be made a spectacle for the googling eyes of drunken men. And now let's talk about how this decision was made. You had Artaxerxes, who was drunk at the time, getting advice from equally intoxicated advisors. These men somehow concluded that Vashti's refusal to break the law was somehow an offense to every married man in Persia. Talk about misguided groupthink. This is what happens when alcohol-fueled pride meets collective ego. Now, what makes this even more tragic is that when Artaxerxes sobered up and realized what he'd done, he couldn't reverse his decision. Even though he regretted it and wanted Vashti back, he was bound by the very legal system he presided over. You see, under ancient Persian law, once a decree was sealed with the king's signet ring, it became absolutely unchangeable. Not even the king himself could revoke it. Why? Because essentially the king was seen as the law and the law couldn't contradict itself. Think about that. The most powerful man in the world, ruling over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, couldn't change his own law once it was sealed. We see the same principle at work in the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Even though the king wanted to save Daniel, he couldn't reverse his own decree. This is what created the crisis with Vashti and later would become central to Esther's story. This is also why when Haman got that first decree sealed with the king's ring, the one ordering the destruction of the Israelites in Persia, it couldn't simply be canceled. Even though Artaxerxes wanted to help Esther, he couldn't just revoke Haman's decree. But here's where Esther's brilliant understanding of the legal system comes in. Instead of trying to get the first decree revoked, which was impossible, Esther asked for permission to write a new law. This reminds me of something that I heard years ago from one of my favorite pastors. It was one of his sermons, the late Dr. Miles Monroe. He once preached about how an airplane flies, not by denying or fighting against gravity, but by creating a force of lift that's greater than the downward pull. In aerodynamics, this is known as Bernoulli's or Bernoulli's principle. When air flows over the curved top of an airplane's wing, it creates lower pressure than the air flowing under the bottom. This difference in pressure generates an upward force called lift. When that lifting force becomes greater than gravity's pull, the plane flies. This is exactly what Esther did with the law. She couldn't cancel Haman's decree. That downward pull, that downward force was still there. Instead, she created a new law with greater force that would effectively lift her people above the threat. Listen to how the king responds to her request. He said, "Write ye also in my name as it seems good to you, and seal it with my ring. For whatever orders are written at the command of the king and sealed with my ring, it is not lawful to gainsay them." In other words, you can't change the law that once is written. Do you see what happened here? Esther couldn't cancel the first law, but she could create a new one that would effectively neutralize it. Her new decree gave her people the legal right to defend themselves against anyone who tried to harm them under Haman's original decree. This was brilliant. Through this new decree sealed with the king's ring, Esther essentially created a legal shield for her people. But notice something else here. Remember how I mentioned that these decrees had to go to all 127 provinces? Well, Esther's decree didn't just give the Israelites permission to defend themselves. The Septuagint tells us they were authorized to use their own laws in every city and to help each other and to treat their adversaries and those who attacked them as they pleased. Think about the scope of this authority. With one stroke of legal genius, she turned what was meant to be a death sentence into a license for her people to live and defend themselves however they saw fit. The legal system that had trapped Vashti and seemed to seal the Israelites' fate became the very instrument of their deliverance. This story shows us something powerful about how God works. Just as he gave Esther the wisdom to create a law greater than Haman's decree, like the law of lift overcoming the law of gravity, God often provides solutions that transcend our obstacles. What looked like an unchangeable death sentence became an opportunity for divine deliverance through legal wisdom. Her story teaches us that it's not enough to just pray, though that's essential. We also need to be willing to learn, to understand, and to use the systems we're dealing with. Notice how God didn't just deliver his people miraculously by changing the king's heart, although that was a part of it. He also gave Esther the wisdom to create a solution within the existing system. When we face systems that are unjust or seem unchangeable, God can give us the strategy to work within those very systems to bring about justice. Sometimes we are waiting for the Most High to change everything around us when he's already given us the solution. He's already given us the wisdom. It's already been provided. The very system that looks like it's working against us can become the instrument that God uses for our deliverance. Now, while this wraps up our discussion of Esther's story, I'm excited to tell you that this is just the beginning. The Septuagint has revealed so many fascinating insights about other biblical stories that I cannot wait to share with you. I have found it to be an incredible resource that adds rich detail and context to the scriptures we know and love. In future videos, we're going to explore more of these hidden treasures, and I'll even explain why the Septuagint is such a valuable tool for understanding our biblical heritage. Now, share in the comments. What stood out to you most from Esther's story? Was it her faith, her strategy, or this legal wisdom we discussed today? In closing, remember, depending on your preferred platform, you can find my content on TikTok at SMSocietyJW, on Instagram at the SM Society, and on YouTube at the Supermodel Society. Also, if you haven't already done so, pick up your copy of High Value, The Prayer of a Queen, which you can get on Amazon as well as Google Play. With that, salama and barakah, in other words, peace and blessings.